Well, good afternoon. We are going to be talking about the sequester's impact upon the rebalance or the pivot to Asia. And with us in the studio is Mr. Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum CSIS. And we're here christening for Brad and myself, Brad and me. We're christening the new ThinkTech studio in the lower level of Pioneer Plaza. And nice to have you here, Brad.
Thanks, Dave. It's good to be back.
So let's begin, Brad, by talking about kind of the purpose and history of the sequester. Let's get into that a little bit for people in the audience. You know, there's been a lot of talk in the news. It's kind of, the media, in some sense, has it partially garbled or greatly garbled. How about give us your take on kind of the background of this, so we can, before we get into its potential impact in the region here.
The background is fairly simple. A few years ago, you had an ongoing budget mess, a failure of negotiations, a huge gap between Democrats and Republicans, and you had, negotiations between the two parties in the House and in the Senate. And then you had the super committee that was set up in the Senate to try to reach a deal, and then you had negotiations with the House Majority Leader, Speaker Boehner, and the President, and a complete inability for them to reach an agreement on a package to go forward that would both create, I think, a sustainable budget as well as one that reduced the deficit over time. So, in a fit of either brilliance or incredible stupidity, and I'll let you can take your pick, they decided that they would come up with essentially a tool that would, in theory, be a Damocletian sword hanging over the heads of the negotiators.
Right.
For those of you that don't have your Greek
something so awful.
Something so awful.
And so stupid.
And so stupid, and emphasis on stupid, that it would, in fact, prove to be the absolute compulsion for them to strike a deal. That it would be that the horrors of not reaching an agreement would be so compelling that you would then ostensibly force both parties to reach an agreement. And what that really consisted of was, on the Democratic side, $500 million, or $1 billion, over a decade of cuts that would hit the programs that ostensibly were important, choice and dear to the Democrats.
Okay.
And on the Republican side, to make it equally unpalatable, at least as far as the traditional conception of a Republican motivation went, was you would take a similar amount out of the defense budget. And it was intended to be just a whack 10% cut. And the theory was that this would force both sides to come to a negotiation. In fact, and I think what everyone knew, was that it would kick the can down the road to make a budget deal. And in fact, everyone was waiting for the November election. And the election would then prove who was right, where the public lie. Was it behind President Obama with his mix of spending cuts, entitlement cuts and tax increases, or would it be a pure spending cut side as advocated by the Republicans? And as everyone knows...
So it's a kick the can procedure to get past the election?
To get to the election, and then in theory after that you would just then you would get serious about negotiating. And then, so the President wins, the Republican Party maintains control of the House, and those are the two big variables, even though their number of seats was reduced, as well as the fact that the Democrats retained control of the Senate. So divided government.
Okay.
The point was that it didn't prove the election wasn't the forcing event that everyone thought it would be. And as time progressed, they figured it ended up that you had both the agreement, or the fact that you ultimately reached a deal with on the tax cuts, such that you had the Republicans finally breaking their pledge never ever to increase taxes, and to vote for an increase in taxes of the people that made over $450,000 a year. And for them, that was a huge psychological blow. And what it also did, though, was harden their resolve. And it ends up, in fact, that more Republicans today seem to be prepared to tolerate those cuts in the defense budget than has historically been the case. The argument was the Republicans were always going to defend national security and would never allow this huge meat cleaver.
So maybe that side of the blade of the sword of Damocles got dulled.
Absolutely. And so what you ended up with is a Republican Party now that says, either way, we got cuts, and we can live with that. Our mandate was to shrink the size of the government, and we did that. And consequently, we're happy with the result. And truthfully, as far as this group is concerned, the defense cuts aren't that big a deal. And the Democrats seem to be thinking that they can live with the cuts on their side, as well as the fact, I think, that they feel they're winning, or were at least, winning the PR battle.
Boy, I wish we had had that kind of succinct explanation in some of the media reports. That was terrific, Brad. All right, so let's hold on the sequester for a moment, and let's add into the mix here a phenomenon that I call the NOA cliff, which is that the loss of Senator Inouye's largesse in the Congress, and put those two together and look at what's the impact now in terms of federal budget on the state of Hawaii. We'll move into the region in a moment, but locally here, what's the impact?
It's hard to distinguish between the two. I mean, because you haven't had any deals struck as yet, and so what will happen, I think the loss of Senator Inouye's seniority, his extraordinary grasp of budgeting, his prestige, his weight, power, and influence in the Senate will be felt only after they start negotiating the next budget. And only after they start coming up with a deal, and they've got, these are the funds that you have, and this is where they'll be allocated to.
Okay, so the Inouye piece comes later.
I don't think we have any sense of what that means.
Okay, let's go back to the sequester issue now and its impact on Hawaii. I noticed a headline of the Star Advertiser today that the military brass at least as it were reported, that they made some comments to some legislators that this is going to be a pretty severe situation.
I find that a little hard to believe. There's no doubt that this will be it will be heartfelt, and certain people have and already are feeling the impact of this. People are, at the end of the day, you're taking a meat cleaver to the budget, and that, I mean, before we even get to that, I mean, let's talk about really the stupidity of the sequester. And mind you, this is a self-inflicted wound and was designed precisely to be stupid, is that it took a meat cleaver to a budget that admittedly needs some trimming. And maybe even there need to be some big whacks in terms of some of the expenses. But the way that it needs to be done is intelligently, with an understanding of where the immediate, short, and long-term impacts of decision. You don't just take a meat cleaver and whack off 10% hither and yon and assume that you can get away with that without feeling consequences. So, in that sense, that's really where the problem was, but it wasn't supposed to be that way. It was supposed to be painful and dumb, and apparently it wasn't painful and dumb enough.
So let's talk about consequences now for here in Hawaii. Consequences could have been avoided if they'd done it a different way, but now we got to live with the consequences. And so, what are they here in Hawaii?
Well, I mean, of course, it's a wide range because it's a cut to all of the entire federal budget, and that means that there are monies that are not being spent on education, there are monies that are not being spent on health, there are money that are not going to be spent on infrastructure investments, there's money that is not going to be spent on protection of whether it's customs, whether it's immigration, whether it's FBI. Every federal agency, with the exception of certain groups of services, it gets a cut. I think, for example, Social Security checks were exempted, Medicare, Medicaid were exempted as well.
But those federal agencies, with the exception of the Department of Defense, their cuts are fairly modest because the meat cleaver side is spread out over all those agencies, right?
True, but
disproportionately.
True, but it doesn't. But remember, it doesn't just have to go to a federal government agency. I mean, the federal government gives states a lot of money. Those are the block grants that we keep hearing about as well, and consequently, all of those are being reduced. So you lose a lot of money. You hear frequently, I'm sure many of our readers here read or know about this famous matching grants. There's this project, whether it's the rail or whether it's a harbor or whether it's something where the government puts up X amount of funds if the state does. Well, those funds are now cut as well. And so you have the ripple effects are beginning to be felt. And so if you really want to go, you can actually go. The White House has put up a website that actually state by state will tell you precisely what cuts are anticipated for each particular state.
How would you describe the consequences for Hawaii?
Well, it's still too early to tell. Again, just as I think you and I were discussing the fiscal cliff in either was it December or January, and I was making the case that it's not a cliff; it was at best a fiscal escalator or or a stairwell or something, because it was clearly going to be taking time. And we have the same thing. I mean, the sequester is going to play out over a period of weeks and months. And over time, both it will get sharper and people will be beginning to adjust.
Well, what about this? What about all this talk of various cabinet officials, the president, all this traveling around the country talking about this, that we're going to see apocalypse now take place?
Well, I think everyone was exaggerating. It's not a smart idea, but that doesn't mean that the sky is falling. And I think you've seen perhaps a fall. You've seen a fall in the president's approval rating, for example, because I think he may have been a little bit too far out in front. You had the Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, making some comments about teachers getting pink slips. That was in fact the case. There was a claim that the White House was going to have to cut off its janitors. That apparently was, there's some distinction between whether they were going to be collecting overtime checks and what the impact of that was going to be. You know, you've got the White House announcing that it's cutting off tours, but not, you know, because what happens is that if you have a tour, you have to have Secret Service agents lining the halls to make sure that nobody goes, you know, zipping off in the back of the tour and stealing ashtrays or something. So, you know, and you've got to wonder that in a straitened fiscal environment, is that the best use of your Secret Service manpower or person power? And the answer is probably no. So, you know, we feel all of this, but again, because of the way that it was intended to be dumb and so heavy-handed, that it would hopefully push the legislators to make a deal and hopefully avert some of the more severe consequences that flow from that. And you know, I think we're going to see that. You're already having discussion of a continuing resolution, and in fact, when they do a continuing resolution, and this is what all the jockeying is about right now in Washington, is that you can then write another budget bill that actually compensates for these decisions. That as they write new legislation to empower the government to spend money, they make changes about where it goes and what the baselines are. So you mitigate the impact that way.
But let's assume that there's a continuing continuing resolution with no amendments.
Okay.
And let's go back. I know this is difficult for you, but focus on the crystal ball issue here. What's your bet as to the way Hawaii's going to feel this sequester? Where are we going to see the pain?
Well, I mean, the immediate impact, or not the immediate impact, but the anticipated impact at least is $134 million of lost gross income, for example, from the 20% of civilian employees that are going to be laid off from the DoD. They're not laid off, but furloughed, or given there's 1 day a week. And that's, it's $134 million.
And there's a ripple effect throughout the economy.
I think that is the ripple effect included. Includes the multiple. But that's still a chunk of change.
Yeah.
How do you feel the impact of longer security lines at the airport? How do you feel the impact of slower longer lines at immigration? Are people going to want to come to this country because they're afraid it's just going to be too troublesome to get in and get out?
We'll be back with more after the break on the impact of the sequester. We are back, we are live, and you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. This is KGU 760 AM, part of the Wall Street Business Network, and you're listening to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. And we'll be talking about the sequester's impact on the pivot to Asia with Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum, who's here in the studio with us. But before we get there, let me bring on the CEO of ThinkTech, Mr. Jay Fidel, with some information about a fascinating program coming up the end of the month here at the Plaza Club. So here's Jay.
Oh, thank you, David. Well, I want to talk about the state side of pretty much what you guys are talking about. I mean, the sequester wouldn't come up if we had more money. And we have a program on March 28th that's going to discuss that kind of thing on the state level, answering the question, how is Hawaii going to pay for its new initiatives if we don't have enough money? It's our midterm legislative report. It's going to be moderated and organized by Bob Toyofuku of Hawaii Advocates. We're talking about unliquidated and liquidated indebtedness, often deferred and delayed for years, kick the can down the road, and collectively this amounts to billions. We're going to be talking about fiscal policy, about social and business incentive programs, about public union demands. Do we have enough money to do what we want to do, what we need to do, and how do we handle this? That's the question. So do we need to raise money? Do we need to raise taxes? Or is there something else? And what the answer to these questions are is kind of core to public policy. It's critical to the fiscal health of the state and the fiscal future of the state. So Bob Toyofuku and some of his friends are going to try to answer that, his friends in the legislature and his friends from the business community. I'm sure there's going to be some surprises. Maybe even Brad will come. Maybe even Brad will talk. That's Brad Glosserman, your guest, David. Anyway, March 22nd at the Plaza Club. You want to sign up and see this, sign up at hvca.org. Seating is limited, so sign up today. Thank you, David.
Jay,
back to you.
Jay, if during the course of this program they start to develop an idea called the sequester, I hope you'll run around and start pulling the plugs on the microphones.
Why don't you ask them to call up now and see if they call, get their hands around this with some questions.
I think they should talk to Brad Glosserman before
I don't know. I would say from the first 20 minutes of the show, I would say that if talking about domestic issues in Hawaii, probably I'm not your guy, but hey.
Well, Brad, let's get back to our topic here about right before the break, we were talking about the consequences, the impact of the sequester here in Hawaii. And you mentioned a little bit about the impact upon the civilian Department of Defense workforce. And before that, kind of spread out a number of different federal agencies here that are going to take a hit. And then you also mentioned these matching grants and federal grants coming into the state of Hawaii that perhaps going to take a hit over time.
Will take a hit.
They are going to take a hit. Okay. Let's focus on the Department of Defense now, the military side of things. What are we going to see from our various bases?
Well, the commander of Pacific Command, Admiral Locklear, has been in Washington testifying for the last 3-4 days on specifically these questions, trying to outline his priorities for the next couple of years and how precisely he will be accommodating the pivot, or accommodating both the sequester, how he'll try to make it work, and how he will try to implement the rebalance. And I think that the first thing that he says, all of the other commanders have said, and that all of the various the components commanders have said, is that there will be no impact on mission critical stuff. So that you don't, the things that we need, that our soldiers need to do their jobs on a day-to-day basis, will not be affected. And one of the things that I've been am always most impressed with our military is that they are a result-oriented, mission-focused organization.
Right, I agree with you on that.
And so, they understand this is what they have to do. This is a readiness that they have to be prepared for. This is their mission. This is, you have to deter North Korea. You have to be prepared to defend the sea lanes. You have to, whatever the various little bits and pieces of their mandate is, they will do that. They will be prepared, and they have been anticipating and lining up, to prepare for these cuts. So they know what they have to do to accomplish their mission. That will not be compromised. The question, though, becomes is that while they're ready to handle what you're going to look at today, and that's where your money needs to go, where are you going to be? Are you going to necessarily have the same funds to think about and to prepare for what you need to be doing in 5 years down the line or 10 years down the line? And so in that sense, that's where the cuts come. And that's where, when your choice is between having fuel, for a plane to fly today, or having, ammunition for a weapon system tomorrow, versus thinking strategically about potential contingencies in 5 years' time, it's the latter that's going to take a hit. It's one other thing that I wanted that you and I discussed earlier, and I think is really important to mention. And I was looking that historically, since 1945, since the Second World War, in every single war, there has been a substantial drop-off of the defense budget. I think after World War II it was 43%. I think after the Vietnam, I think it was 33%. But somewhere in the nature between 43 to 33%, there has been a drop in the budget.
But that makes practical sense if you think about it historically, right?
Sure.
There would be the big build-up, and then you
draw down, you have to replenish your forces. Of course, you're going to spend money on different things, but the fact of the matter is that the up-tempo operational side drops off, and consequently, you don't have those immediate demands.
Okay.
The interesting and important fact for us and for our readers is that even with the sequester, even with this draconian cut to the defense budget, the U.S. defense budget this year will only constitute a 31% cut after 10 years of fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. So in other words, by every historical benchmark, this is the smallest cut, even on with this absurd, stupid, and heavy-handed mechanism. Even then, this is still the smallest reduction in defense spending following a conflict we've had in the last 60 years.
Okay, well, let me play the devil's advocate on the other side there. If you take each of those defense cuts historically, starting from World War II, none of those have been made, as far as I can recall, using a meat cleaver approach. They were able to, the percentage may be higher, but it was done
intelligently.
Done intelligently with some long-range planning.
Sure, of course. And again, there's no one suggesting that the sequester as being handled is the smart way to go. Although, in truth, I think there are some people in Congress for whom the goal of a small government, no matter what the cause, no matter what the consequences, is really the most important goal. And consequently, as I said, folks that historically been thought would be prepared to defend the defense budget against all challenges are no longer interested, and they're finding that, hey, we can cut the defense program. Interestingly enough, is that there is not only, truthfully, the people with whom I'm referring to essentially are the Tea Party. They're the ones that want to see small government at any cost. Interestingly, this notion of a huge 30% cut in the defense budget would also historically align with the far left. If you think about whatever you want to call the
peace types,
the peaceniks, however you wish to refer to them, dismissively or otherwise, they too would like to see this bloated defense bureaucracy brought down to size. So, curiously, on the right and the left, you have a common cause. There is no one who believes that the United States needs to be spending as much money as it does, or that the money that it's spent, it's getting the most bang for its buck, that it is an efficient and effective way of budgeting. And so there's no doubt that reductions can be done. Now, whether or not we can accommodate a 31% cut in the budget as we've had is another matter, but certainly you can't do it with this just ham-handed, heavy machete-yielding approach.
So here in Hawaii, what you're saying is that we've got a no change operationally to the uniformed military, and the impact is going to be felt upon the civilian side of the
uniformed military over time, but over a time horizon of 5, 10, 15 years, as weapon systems get drawn out, as tempos slow down, as we lose the ability to anticipate and prepare for future contingencies.
Very good. Well, we'll have more. We'll be talking about the new foreign policy team when we come back after the break. Stay with us. We are back, and we're talking about the sequester's impact upon the pivot to Asia. And our guest in the studio with us is Mr. Brad Glosserman, who's the executive director of the Pacific Forum CSIS. By the way, Pacific Forum is rather highly rated as a foreign policy think tank.
I certainly rate us highly. The CSIS, our mothership, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has been rated once again the leading think tank in the world for foreign policy and security studies. That's an assessment, I think, based on a vote. I think it's sort of like we actually, few people know this. There's an American Idol type program where us defense analysts and security people go on TV.
That's right.
We we answer questions. There's a dancing segment. I think the bathing suit segment, which I missed this year.
Is that the one that Ralph does? He does the bathing suit segment.
I think in the interest of keeping my job, I'll probably not pursue that too far. But nevertheless, there is a recitation thing, and we do extemporaneous speaking, I believe. Declamation, something like that. But,
sequester,
yes,
impact.
We do that too.
There's been a lot of reporting, Brad, that the initiative of the Obama administration, the so-called rebalance or pivot, or sometimes it's rearranging the deck chairs, depending on how you want to view that. But the ability of this administration to implement that pivot is going to be restrained by this sequester. What's your view of that?
I laugh. I fling my nose at them. It's silliness.
Fling my nose at them.
Yes, I haughty derision and disdain. No, it won't happen. And there is the pivot, the rebalance, whatever we want to call it, is a policy that has, in truth, been in place for longer than this administration. Didn't we do a show on this?
We did.
Okay, I need to remember how much to recapitulate.
But there are some viewers who are listeners who are
We'll
not with that prior show.
Right. And
with us.
And the point that I made then, and I think we need to underscore here, is that the pivot represents an understanding in the United States government that Asia is where the action is, and that it is of increasing importance to U.S. future interests. That's where economic dynamism is. We need to more tightly couple ourselves to Asia so that we can capture that energy and that we can grow and our economy can continue to pick up.
Okay, so now we have these cuts.
Right. Well, but wait a minute. Let's quite jump to that number. And I think it's also important to recognize that, in fact, this recognition of Asia's importance truly predates the Obama administration. This idea that somebody claimed we're back in Asia was nonsense. We never left Asia. Maybe we didn't have a concept, and we certainly had something else that would overshadow this focus on Asia. But as early as 2000, I could see a foreign policy pendulum swinging from Europe. It was supposedly, I like the metaphor would be this pendulum was swinging from Europe to Asia, and it got stuck in Central Asia when September 11th hit.
I see.
So, and again, so this is ongoing. And if that's the case, if it is an ongoing policy, then I would argue, I think successfully, that it ain't going to stop just because you have a across-the-board cut in the defense budget or in the U.S. budget. Moreover, if in fact this rebalance consists of more than just a military operation, which it is.
Okay.
In fact,
there are other agencies.
It's diplomatic and it's economic. Then, and only third do we talk about it in its military component. And I think, as always, this emphasis on the military is misplaced. It's important, but that's not the way we should think about it. And so, if in fact you have these other implementing mechanisms of the rebalance, then this focus on whether or not, how many days an aircraft carrier is deployed is wrong, because just as important are trade negotiations to create a web of relationships that deeper embed the United States.
All right, let me stop you for a second. The military
Thank you.
gets cut, State Department gets cut, and the Office of the Trade Representative, U.S. Trade Representative, gets cut. So all of the federal agencies involved in the pivot get whacked.
But they get whacked across the board.
Okay.
So what I would argue is that the momentum, what you've heard, what we hear from people when we talk to is they say that what you're going to at least see is a level.
Okay.
And the famous quote from somebody the other day was, "Level is the new up," right? So if if the Asia Pacific only takes a 70% cut, and say our forces in Europe take or a 30% cut, 70% maintain budget levels, but you take a 50, 60, 70% cut elsewhere, then in fact in relative terms you still maintain your focus. That's what you're going to see, and that's what you're going to see because that's where U.S. interests lie.
All right, let's flip it around the other way. What's your view of the perception, and talk in terms of consequences, of this sequester's impact upon the pivot? What's the perception from the other side, that is our Asian allies, on this?
And that's where you make a good case, even though you probably don't know it. The point is the perceptions are bad. I mean, and this is something that we faced over the last year and a half, as we've had constant conversations with both allies, partners, friends, adversaries across the region, and that is the perception of dysfunction in the United States. The inability of our politicians to make decisions, to stick by them, the inability of our politicians to present a face of a competent and capable leadership is really what undermines U.S. status and power in the world. And that is this sense that we are either unable to meet our commitments, that we are feckless, that we are inconsistent, that we are absorbed with problems at home. All of this makes people think that the United States is not engaged, that it marginalizes us as far as they're concerned. That's the danger. The sequester is a demonstration, again, of the inability of the American political system to do its job.
And so that's the consequence.
That's the consequence.
Okay, I got you now.
I'm not going to have to tell you again.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening to this program and you want to put a question to Brad, you can join the conversation by calling us at area code 808-296-5467. Well, let's use that as a segue. Are there going to be different foreign policy changes as a result of a new team now?
Obviously, on some levels, you will. I mean, one of the things that's actually been quite surprising, is the conversations. I was in Beijing a few weeks ago, talking with a number of Chinese experts. We were holding some meetings, and what was striking was this notion somehow or other. I mean, first of all, that Hillary Clinton, as far as they were concerned, was pretty close to the devil incarnate. She was responsible for the new aggressiveness, as far as the talking points were concerned that we heard. She was responsible for the aggressiveness in American foreign policy. She was the one.
And that all comes from her one statement that she made in Hanoi having to do with the South China Sea?
No, I mean, I think number one, there was that statement. It's certainly what started it. Number two, there were the comments that which were not new, but nevertheless she was front and center making statements that Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty would apply to the dispute over the Senkaku values, and her additional comment, which is important, that the United States did not want any country to unilaterally change the situation regarding those islands. The latter in particular, I think the Chinese were offended by. And so, and I think that what happens is the Chinese are clearly unhappy with that position. And by blaming it on her and suggesting that she, in fact, was the guilty party, what it allows is that it opens the door, in theory, to the United States moderating its position and changing its stance. The corollary of the Hillary Clinton slagging, if you will, was some hope that Secretary Kerry, and at the time Senator Kerry, would be seen as more accommodating of China. And I've actually seen printed commentary to that extent that suggests, number one, that Mr. Kerry is not quite as hard-nosed, that he's a more traditional diplomat. The Chinese seem to be more pleased. They've looked for his statements, both in his confirmation speech about China, his comments about the sequester and about the pivot, and the Chinese, and frankly, some of our other allies in the region as well, are a little concerned that Secretary Kerry will not be as committed to this rebalance as perhaps as Secretary Clinton was, and that somehow this is a harbinger of a change in policy. The bottom line, of course, is that's absurd, because the Secretary of State, sadly, or for better or for worse, doesn't set U.S. foreign policy. In large measure, they implement it, and which is, of course, well, not of course. I was quite struck in listening to many of the post-mortems and the assessments of Secretary Clinton's tenure, which I think completely missed the point. They were acknowledging the degree to which control of foreign policy has been increasingly centralized in the White House, and that the State Department has lost some of its autonomy, and the Secretary is less of the figure that she was. And I think that is a mistake.
Is it true?
Well, I think that,
has
yes.
the foreign policy activity of the role of the Secretary of State been pulled back into the White House?
The role, no. I think the decision-making and the policy should come from the White House. It's the president's foreign policy, and these individuals implement it. They work with the president to help set it. I mean, and that's ultimately you have. Remember, go back to 2008 when we were talking about this cabinet of equals. Remember, right. And you had all these powerful personalities. You had Gage, you had Clinton, you had other folks that were supposedly very strong who would be prepared to argue it out in front of the president, and then he would make a decision based on the best judgments of these independent actors, and then they would implement. So you had that, but at the end of the day, you took the best that you could from these people. But at the end of the day, it's the president's foreign policy, and these people implemented.
Well, is the implementation policy process that we are seeing from this administration, is it pulled more into the White House than it was in previous administrations?
No, not implementation, no, because implementation invariably has to be devolved and pushed out, delegated, if you will, to the departments. That's what they're there for. But it's a question of, and what we didn't have, for example, it seems to me, as a point of comparison, back in the first George W. Bush administration, was you didn't have a mechanism to really effectively reconcile those views. And so you had some really, really bruising fights, as you'll recall, between Colin Powell and the State Department and his cadres, if you will, and Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney in the Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon, and in the old Executive Office building in the Office of the Vice President, respectively. And those were some pretty ugly fist fights. Well, unfortunately, there's no violence, but you saw those played out in public very well, and that's, to me, a visual fight scrum of that nature is a failure of the policy process. You don't want, I mean, you certainly want that battle of views, but you don't want it to be done so publicly. You don't want it to look as though the administration's disorganized. You want it to be processed better, and then when the decisions are made, you want it to be implemented effectively, quietly, and done in a very consistent manner. That's what's been missing, I think, or that was what was missing back then. Now, what you've seen, however, I think in Secretary Clinton, although that's not what we're here to talk about, was very effective as a representative of the United States government in changing in a lot of ways that diplomacy is done. What she will be recognized for, and I think this is one of the things that the pundits missed, was her ability to change literally the way that the United States practices diplomacy, the way that we pushed people out into the field, the use of electronic diplomacy, Twitter, all of this social media. This is going to be, I think, viewed retrospectively as absolutely revolutionary. It carried risk, as we saw in Benghazi, because clearly when you go out into the people, you reduce the barriers, you accept certain risks and potential consequences.
Okay, well, you think you see a change with under Secretary Kerry? Hold that thought. We'll talk about that after the break. We are back. This is Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights, and we're talking about the sequester's impact and also the President's new foreign policy team. And the question I put to our guest, Brad Glosserman, right at the break was, under the new Secretary of State, former Senator John Kerry, Brad, what do you think? Changes in the way, changes in policy might we expect in the Asia-Pacific region, or changes in the way it's implemented, or?
Again, my sense is that what you're going to see is the president's policy will continue. Kerry, though, is a very different type of politician than was Secretary Clinton. You know, he's been used before as sort of an emissary and an envoy in particular hotspots. He seems to enjoy really getting involved and rolling up his sleeves and dealing with these problems. So I might expect him to be a bit more engaged on certain issues. And so the way he conducts his diplomacy, I think, clearly is going to be different. He's not going to have the rock star appeal of Secretary Clinton for so many reasons, not least of which is he's not a woman. And I think that Secretary Clinton's vibrance, intelligence, capability, her just, I think, and I'm a big fan, quite obviously. I think that her performance was important as a benchmark for many young women, and as a role model, and even as capable as Secretary Kerry will, I'm sure, prove.
Well, he's more gaffe prone than she is, I think.
Well, I can't think of a gaffe that the Secretary committed, mind you. I'm talking about gaffes versus mistakes. But I think it's just a different kind of personality, a different kind of operating procedure. It will be very interesting, yes, to see the reception. I think the Chinese are clearly expecting him to go easier. They're expecting him not to be as offensive, for him to perhaps, I mean, they're in fact anticipating, and you're seeing some of the reporting that suggests that the Chinese see the sequester as an opportunity for the Americans to abandon some of the sharper edges of the rebalance policy.
Back off a little bit.
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
And I think that's a mistake. Number one, because I don't think it's aimed at them, and number two, because the degree to which the policy changes is not going to be a function of funding. Or personnel. Sorry.
Okay, so we just have about a minute left here. What would you just rattle off as best you can? What do you think of the three top objectives of this new foreign policy team for our region, for Asia?
Objectives are mind you, objectives versus immediate challenges. And you first, during the break, you asked me about challenges.
Okay,
because
let's
the immediate
go with challenges.
Challenges number one are going to be dealing with North Korea. The United Nations Security Council just passed new resolutions, and the North Koreans responded with they have a right of a preemptive nuclear strike, and they're going to eliminate the armistice. There's problem number one. Problem number two is going to be ensuring that China and Japan can find some sort of modus vivendi over the disputed islands in the East China Sea, and that they're going to be able to work that out. Problem three is clearly the South China Sea. You may not, or you probably know, but right now there's a conflict in the southern Philippines with Malaysia where you've got 30 people killed. I think handling the shift, the strategic balance in regard to Myanmar, that's in the region. Go further out, and you're going to be how are we going to accommodate, or how are we going to deal with the Iranian problem? Across all of this is how is it that we send the message to our allies and our friends and our adversaries that the United States is not as feckless as we look, that we're committed, that the rebalance is not fashion of the week, that we're going to stay committed, that we're going to implement it, that we're going to be there, that we're going to be a reliable partner, that you can make commitments to the United States that we will honor, and I think very importantly, we need to work on our communications. I mean, we had a meeting yesterday I met with about 20 different intelligence officers from all over Asia, and it is very clear that what they hear us saying and what we think we're saying are two very different things.
So we've got to worry about this consequence of credibility.
Well, there's that, but I think even more basic is this question of what they call strategic communications. We are not getting our message out. What we say is not what people hear. And we've got to make sure that what we say is reinforced by what we do. And then, of course, there's this broader question of looking capable, looking competent, and looking like we're actually going to be able to sustain and follow through.
Well, you know, this has been a firecracker of a discussion, Brad, and I want to thank you very much for this. I know that, you know, the sequester, there's been a lot of confusion about that. There's been a lot of exaggeration, maybe problems of the wrong people or certain people crying wolf, and so that it gets misinterpreted. But I think the message that you've given us here is that from an operational standpoint, it looks to you like the armed forces, the folks in uniform, no change.
Well, I mean, there will be some changes. Well, let's not exaggerate. But I think they're capable of handling the changes. I think that as always, the message that I would take away from all of this is that the great, you know, it's Pogo, that we've met the enemy and he is us. The greatest threat to the United States' position in the world is the United States. It is our inability to deliver on the promise of who we are, and I mean the larger image of an image of American competence, of commitment, of capability in the world. That, and no one is undermining that as much as we are.
Interesting and sad at the same time.
And unfortunately true.
Yeah.
But and I think we need to double down. We need to be really cognizant of all of these particular issues and all of the ways that on a really fundamental and elemental level, that what we say is not necessarily what other people hear. And, you know, communications is not only about what you say.
Right. Well, thank you so much, and I just want to remind everyone that you've been listening to Pacific Forum's Issues and Insights. We've been talking with Mr. Brad Glosserman, the Executive Director of Pacific Forum CSIS, and we'll see you next, or we'll talk to you next Thursday with another program that'll be relating to international business or foreign policy on ThinkTech Radio. So thank you so much for listening, and we will see you down the road.